A lot of words get thrown around when we talk about how we think the world should be run. Democracy, republic, capitalism, markets, communism, socialism, individualism, liberalism, conservatism, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, tyranny. There are even some obscure useful words that we have French speakers to thank for, like laissez-faire and dirigism. Thanks to vitriol and hyperbole, many of these words are frequently and sometimes deliberately misused. Without a shared and agreeable vocabulary, it is nearly impossible to have a sane and rational discussion about how we should run the world. Running around calling everyone you disagree with a corporatist pig or a Nazi simply cannot lead to anything productive. So let's start with democracy. Since I expect most of the audience to be from Western democracies, you probably already know this, but it's worth repeating. Your system of government is not a democracy. Democracy is the method by which you select your government. Democracy is not statically linked to concepts like markets. Democracy isn't even linked to structures of government. Compare the United States to the United Kingdom. In the United States, it's a republic, but the United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy. Both are democracies. In both cases, elections rarely change the structure of government. They do not create new legislative bodies or add court systems. For the most part, elections only influence government policy. This is an interesting point because once you realize that elections can almost never change the structure of the government, you start to really consider what elections really do change. Note that in over 200 years there has been exactly one change to the structure of the U.S. government, and that change was the 17th Amendment to directly elect the Senate. Changing the structure of a government is no easy task. Anyway, back to the point. What do elections really change? Elections change policy. Policy is a huge word, and that means a lot of things. There's foreign policy, trade policy, tax policy, monetary policy, military policy, social policy, defense policy, educational policy, drug policy. Now take note that capitalism and socialism and a bunch of other isms are not policies. These are philosophies that might inform a person's choice of policy. Also, notice that these isms are not systems of government. That means you can vote for your capitalist, socialist, fundamentalist, or whatever else-ist philosophy without necessarily being out to undermine democracy. That, of course, requires and probably deserves a whole other conversation. All that being said, what kind of government do we have in the United States? To my eye, it appears we have a capitalist government. But what exactly is that? It's my belief that the commonly spoken descriptions of capitalism hide an underlying ugly truth. We are told that capitalism means free markets, but let's be clear, markets are just a means to determine how much of what to produce and what the prices of those products are. Markets are not a system of morality or fairness. Our markets are most certainly not free either. Two very profitable industries are oil and telecommunications, and these industries are walled off to competition through restricted rights of way needed for laying cable or restricted use of radio spectrum needed for wireless service. Oil production in the U.S., particularly offshore production, is controlled by a system of mining permits that ensure that only those already producing ridiculous sums of money from oil production can afford the mining permits. The rules we have in place for these industries benefit whom exactly? The majority shareholders of corporations like AT&T and ExxonMobil. Let's examine the word capitalism. What is capital? It's money or wealth. What if we said we had a moneyism government? Would it be surprised then that our policies are configured to benefit those with money? In the U.S., you have a right to free speech. Free speech is political power. It allows you to share new ideas and challenge what you see as bad ideas. Speech is power. You're allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money in advertising, even political advertising, and this is because you have a right to free speech. And spending money on advertising is speech, isn't it? So if money is speech, and speech is power, and money is power, then what do we have? We have a society where a great deal of power has been accumulated in the hands of a very few, determined by, you guessed it, capital. If you have more money, you quite explicitly have more freedom and more power to protect your money and freedom. If you studied the U.S. Constitution, it's constructed as a set of checks and balances and a separation of powers. The structures of the U.S. government is built to prevent an accumulation of governmental powers, and it has done well in that goal. What it does not do is prevent an accumulation of economic powers. All this is perfectly fine within the letter of the law. There are other places where wealth is a determining factor in freedom. Let's look at how our justice system operates. When you have more wealth, you get better lawyers. You're better able to access and use the court system to protect your rights and interests. If you're poor, you can have a court-appointed lawyer if you're accused of a crime. If you are poor and believe you are being wronged by a giant corporation, you can't have a court-appointed lawyer to prosecute a civil offense against the party that wronged you. And when you are accused of a crime and you do get a court-appointed lawyer, he is probably underpaid by public funds. And the axiom holds true, you get what you pay for. If the public isn't paying for good court-appointed lawyers, the public doesn't have good court-appointed lawyers. Justice is most certainly unequally applied on the basis of wealth. Heck, even our money has a hidden tax applied upon it. All U.S. dollars in circulation exist as a debt to the Federal Reserve, who then collects interest on that debt. And guess where that interest goes? Well, to answer that, you need to know a couple of things. The Federal Reserve is not a government organization. It is a privately owned corporation chartered by the government. But who owns it? Well, the Federal Reserve member banks own the Federal Reserve. Well, who are they? It's a pretty long list, but if you look, you'll find names like Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Chase, the usual suspects. And who owns these banks? The wealthy. Now, sure, poor people own a few shares here and there, but overwhelmingly, most of these big corporations are owned, for the most part, by a wealthy few. Now put these pieces together, and you'll see that the very act of circulating currency causes a payment to the wealthy. Even if you refuse to use a bank and deal only in cash at all times, you are not immune to this, as ultimately the people paying back the loan that created the money have to demand more from you to pay back their loans. Is capitalism democratic? Certainly, so long as enough people keep voting for capitalism. Is voting against capitalism undemocratic? No. But if you have money and know that this is how the current system works, you'd be willing to spend a piece of it for speech that teaches the public about how wonderful our supposed free markets are, and how the huge profits of ExxonMobil are a sign that the economy is doing well, and hope that most people don't clue in on that they're merely peasants in a hidden serfdom. And what's the alternative? I mean, there are a few. My favorite is a thing called socialism, but you probably heard that that's evil. If you own the media, of course, anything that is a threat to a system that ensures a life of luxury and power is evil. We are taught in our schools from textbooks written and published by people with money that socialism is the evil the West conquered in World War II and the Cold War. And we are taught that socialism is the tool of tyrants like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. And we are told that if we seek a socialist goal, then we must surrender our freedoms and submit to state-owned planned economies that cause food shortages. Of course, none of that is true. It's entirely possible to have a socialist government that is democratically elected and constitutionally limited. Socialism does not require a tyrant. You can keep your free speech. You can keep your guns. You can keep your right to a trial by jury. True socialism is a system that distributes the benefits of government based solely on the merit of being a human being, and not on the merit of having accumulated wealth. Our government could replace the Federal Reserve System with one where all currency is loaned from a public institution, and pay the collected interest to the government instead of the shareholders of banks. If the private oil industry is making a lot of money from oil produced on public lands or offshore permits, well then raise the price of those permits and let the public enjoy the benefit of the exploitation of public resources. The same could be done with wireless radio spectrum and public rights-of-way used by the telecommunications industry. free markets don't need to be closed. It just needs to be rationalized that the excessive profits are not a sign of a healthy economy. They are a sign of insufficient competition. Once you make that connection, you can choose policies that promote competition. In some cases, competition is genuinely not desirable, frequently in industries where a network effect is present. Do we really need 2 sets of telephone wires running 2 competing telephone networks? Or do we need 2 electric networks or 2 sets of water pipes? No, that would be wasteful. But neither can we allow a single entity unlimited control over the exclusive supply of a service or resource. And in those cases, regulation, public ownership, and public investment are appropriate. Our capitalist tax code, where capital gains, that is, increases in the value of property, are taxed less than that of wages, is another example of where our policies benefit the wealthy. Why not instead shift the tax burden onto property taxes that include accumulated wealth as a taxable property? Think about this. Who stands to gain and who stands to lose if we were to choose a government that pressed for socialist values rather than capitalist values? There are only going to be a few groups of people that will argue against it. The wealthy, who do stand to lose some of their power and wealth, those who the wealthy have paid to argue against it, and people who have not yet come to terms with their service to the wealthy.